Yo, what's up guys? Welcome back to the channel. So today I wanted to open up a video talking about some of the most hated Yu-Gi-Oh cards of all time, as I'm working on a video in the future going over the top 10. So this is kind of your guys' time to give me some feedback and ideas for some of the cards that we would consider the most hated Yu-Gi-Oh cards of all time. And I was actually looking through, and there are so many Yu-Gi-Oh cards to go over. Most of these cards have been banned, but there are so many that still exist this day and age. And I'm going to kind of make it so it's through the history of Yu-Gi-Oh, not just the current format. Now, I've looked at a lot of different like news articles online, different blogs. I've even checked out YouTube as far as like the most hated Yu-Gi-Oh cards of all time. And obviously, you know, people have different opinions. I mean, this is just someone's list over here as like the most annoying / hated cards, right? Because they're kind of the same thing. But as a content creator, I've seen so many people complain about very specific cards that some of them we're going to guarantee will make the top 10 list. But this is kind of my video in terms of like a pre-video, if that makes any sense. So it's kind of like a video that is a prequel to what I want to actually go over. So there are certain cards that you'll see time and time again that people complain about, like he had Droplet or he had that one card, right? This is kind of like an introduction to the video as far as like what makes a card actually annoying and what makes people hate a certain card. A lot of times what it comes down to is cards that make it so you cannot respond to, for the most part, right? Like your opponent activates it and you just gotta accept you're taking the L right there, whether that be a card like Droplet or like Super Poly, certain cards that you just can't respond to. And on top of that, there are certain cards where like they are resolving in effect to your opponent's effect, maybe negating your effect, if that makes any sense. So your opponent starts something to negate yours, and then you activate something that not only negates your opponent's card, but then also gives you such a huge advantage. Like if you play, let's say like dinosaurs, right? Or if you played against it, like if you negate something that they do and they have no cards on board, and if they gamma you, you lose, basically. Or any archetype can really do this. They activate a card effect in the hand, you do something, they activate gamma, now they have additional 2 monsters, right? Some of these will require you to play bricks. I remember back in the day, Rescue Rabbit, that was a super hated card. That and Tour Guide got a lot of hate at the end of the day. But I think there are, you know, again, this is like my pre-introduction to like what makes a card actually annoying. But we could even go further back into Yu-Gi-Oh and look at cards like Heavy Storm or Raigeki. These cards were hated by a lot of players, and that's because early on in the game, we didn't have super insanely powerful cards that would just like one card combo into everything, but these cards still generate lots of hate, because if you go on, you know, old school like Yu-Gi-Oh forums, Raigeki and Heavy Storm were cards that people really disliked. I would say it's more so Heavy Storm than Raigeki, because back in the day with Yu-Gi-Oh, it was a little bit more difficult to commit your entire monster board, right? But people would be like, okay, back in the, even in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh, like Summon Laquari set 5 back in the day, that was a play. And if you got heavy, you just took the L. I mean, usually they'd have solo, but that's like back in the day with Yu-Gi-Oh. But like Heavy Storm was actually a super annoying card, because like if you just put one back row, they might hit you up with an MST. Back in the day, people played like Heavy, sometimes Giant Tornado and Mystical Space Typhoon. Those were like the staple back row destructions back in the day. And there's Heavy Storm was a pretty annoying card. Obviously, Feather Duster was banned for a really long time, but another card that I've been seeing up on a lot of people's lists is Change of Heart. Now, this is because back in the day with Yu-Gi-Oh, you could usually just take one person's monster and summon something, and then it would be game sometimes, right? And it was one of those cards where it felt like you kind of got cheated out of. Maybe you attacked your opponent, they magic cylindered you, and then the next turn comes around, they hit you up with a Change of Heart, and they take like your monster with 2,000 or even 3,000 attack, and they would summon another like monster and just make it game real easy. I've also seen Mirror Force kind of on these lists, where it's like you just lose because of just like one specific card, but that's like pretty relevant. I'm not sure if I would put Change of Heart on the list, but I've just seen it again, a card that people really hate. This is again through the history of Yu-Gi-Oh, not the current format only, because I want to make this like a video for like everyone in terms of Yu-Gi-Oh. Now, I've always felt like Evenly Matched was a pretty insane card. It was a really crazy comeback card. But the way I see it, and the reason why some people really hate Evenly Matched, is like you have the advantage, right? You have this insane board, and your opponent goes one card, 1 for 5, right? There are lots of different decks that can absolutely get obliterated by Evenly Matched. But the way I see it is, at least you got to kind of play Yu-Gi-Oh, right? If you comboed off and you somehow can't stop this like one trap card, is it your fault or is it just you kind of playing overly aggressive? So there's kind of like a double-edged sword with evenly matched. Like, in order for this card to be annoying, you had to have popped off when your opponent had nothing, or like, you know, turn one. Again, this is one of those other cards where, like I mentioned before on drop list, because I wanted to build a top 10 list. I don't know if I consider Super Play on there, but it is one of those cards where a lot of people complain about it, because again, when you complain to your friends that you lose, or you hear your friends lose, they're like, dude, he had Super Poly. And like, there really isn't a response to this, for the most part. Technically, I know there's some warrants to your cards, yeah, but for the most part, you can't really respond to the HGGs. Another thing that I've seen on a couple people's lists, or anything related to like negation that's in the form of hand traps, because hand traps completely changed up Yu-Gi-Oh! Back in the day, when hand advantage meant something, nowadays, hand advantage doesn't mean that much when you can just activate one card and like you commit nothing to the board. But Yu-Gi-Oh! Has gotten so fast to the point where I don't know if I would consider these like cards that are like the most hated and annoying cards, but Droll and Lockbird basically just says, no, you're done for the rest of the turn, and so many decks will just straight up lose to Droll. I mean, Ash is obviously less and powerful in the sense where it just like locks your opponent out, which is, you know, in the name here, but at least that's like a 1-for-1 generally with Ash Blossom. Sometimes people like, you know, go for a lot of cards. Speaking of going for a lot of cards, this card I think will definitely be making my top 10 list. This was one of the first Yu-Gi-Oh cards that I saw that I was just like, dude, this is just like, most cards have some insane effect to blow up everything, would have some sort of downside, but this card really didn't have a downside, and it got like multiple upsides. Not only was the condition of like just paying 1,000 life points to destroy everything up on the field super incredibly powerful back in the time of, I was it like Duelist Genesis, right, when the Lightsworn I think first came out, or like Light of Destruction. Actually, yeah, it was Light of Destruction. When Lightsworn first came out, this is before they had JD. Once they got JD in, what was it, Light of Destruction, that was 2008. Yeah, and LOD. Judgment Dragon was just so incredibly powerful, being able to just destroy everything. He keeps himself alive, he swings for 3,000, and then he sends 4 cards. Back in the day when Necro Card was just like, it was a nightmare to deal with. They would get extra wolves. Like, I think Judgment Dragon should probably make this list because it's one of those game-defining cards, and Lightsworn did see a lot of competitive play, and this card was just, it was very hated, definitely, because people would complain about this all the dang time. This is another one of those cards where people complained about, and I'm right there with you on perfection. The thing that's weird with Herald decks just in general, right, is Herald decks would either, let's go ahead and spectate another duel over here for background content. But Herald was a deck where either they would open up like so good and they would negate every single play that you did, or they legitimately wouldn't play at all. Even like when we saw them see play in Drytron, I mean, the whole concept of that deck was basically one player doesn't really get to play. I've always really disliked this card. This one's kind of like a more personal thing because, again, the way that Herald plays is you very rarely get good plays with Herald. It's either one person wombo combos and stops every single thing that you do, or the person bricks and he opens up too many vanillas and he literally can't play so you face roll him. So I think that this card could be on the contender for the top 10, but Judgment Dragon so far is definitely there. Now, some of these I may kind of group up into like one specific card. Things like Roll Oppression / Vandy's Emptiness, they kind of do the same thing, right? Back in the day when Blackwing was seeing play, or even like Teledad, Roll Oppression was just super annoying. The reason why is because it's a trap card, it's been banned, but like what it does is makes it so if you, can we close this thing, or how do we get this thing out of the way? Nonetheless, all it really matters is that one player special summons a bunch of monsters, then they set this card and they act like you can't special summon. They just keep on paying 800 life points. It doesn't really matter. This card just completely dominated formats. Like, if you had Oppression, you were in such a good situation in most scenarios. But that card will probably make it on the top 10 list because, again, that's the whole point of this video, is to get your guys' feedback, because I might miss out on some cards. But I've also seen a lot of people put in like game descriptions, know this card, right? So like some people will put like no Mystic Mind. Obviously Mystic Mind's gonna make the list, but I think Red Eyes Dark Dragoon will 1000% be on my top 10 list of most hated Yu-Gi-Oh cards. The reason why is some decks, literally their entire deck cannot out this one Yu-Gi-Oh card. I remember when Beals was a pretty nasty card to deal with, but Red Eyes Dark Dragoon definitely will be making this list list because this card, out of any of the other Yu-Gi-Oh cards that I've covered, in terms of like seeing like when people host games, they say no playing like, you know, certain cards. This card was a noob stomper, but it was also good and competitive too. Like they did see some play. That card is insane. I already mentioned Mystic Mind, but this will be on the list for sure because it's just annoying to deal with. Now this one's kind of a double-edged sword. Some people love Maxi, some people hate Maxi. I think that there are very good reasons, but it all comes down to kind of the same reason as Oppression, Vandy's Emptiness. You special summon, you do a bunch of stuff, and then your opponent goes and you're like, hey, you want to be able to even combat my board? You're going to give me 50 cards. So I think that this card would be pretty annoying to deal with, and it would make the list. Final Countdown's kind of on the same like spectrum of Mystic Mind. I mean, it's a very annoying card to deal with at the end of the day. Let me move this over here so you guys can maybe see some sort of spectate here in the background. But Final Countdown's always been super annoying to deal with because, you know, if they were playing Final Countdown, it was Wabaku, Battle Fader. I think Tyler Tadman topped with this, and then everyone started playing this deck too. I mean, it was a very, what would be considered mostly in the Yu-Gi-Oh community as a no-skill deck. And that's because, like, you're not really interacting with your opponent for the most part. I remember this card, and Thunder Ruler actually got a lot of hate too, but it's because of this. It's because you actually had to declare your battle phase with that, which people kind of, in a sense, they would, I mean, obviously people want to enter their battle phase, but like people would be like, you didn't declare your battle phase, which you got to do it with Thunder Ruler. It's just part of the game. But online and in person, sometimes people just wouldn't actually, you know, reading cards is kind of hard, right? But nonetheless, I've already mentioned Vandy's. It's kind of the same as Royal Pressure, so I'll probably group these up into like one card on the top 10 list because they're essentially the same card. They're both banned anyways. At the end of the day, it's the same concept of locking your opponent out. Imperial Order automatically wins against certain decks. It's another one of those cards where it's like your opponent opens up with, you just got to accept. If you're playing Sky Strikers, this is a GG. If you're playing the certain decks, it's a GG. And it was banned for reasons, and they put it back in the game. Pretty insane stuff. But speaking of insane stuff, I remember I got to top 10 in competitive when I used to grind on the leaderboards. I played this. I was legitimately getting stream sniped, and I still pushed top 10 with this deck. This deck was probably one of the most broken things ever. At the time, it was the most broken thing. Nowadays, it's not as good. But I remember when this card first came out, it was like the boss monster. If you think of boss monsters, this card deserved the list. There wasn't, at the time, I think Necros were like really popular too. But like this card, man, this card was so dumb in my opinion. And a lot of people as well. Like I played the deck, I built it, and it was just, you would just summon it and people would just quit. It was just, because it was kind of like, you know, Dragoon, like there's no outs for certain decks, but this card would come out and it would knock a card out of your opponent's hand. This card will probably make the list because in terms of boss monsters, you know, in its time, it was very powerful. Same thing with like 86. I kind of want to talk about that, but I think Skill Drain actually got a lot of hate as well, obviously, because once Skill Drain is activated, your whole deck just becomes, am I going to draw the MST? Am I going to draw my out? And nowadays with Yu-Gi-Oh, I think this could still be on the list because people hate dealing with Skill Drain because it's very difficult. Once it's activated, you need, it's like the out or nothing, like real fast too, because Yu-Gi-Oh these days, we don't really pay back row hate in most decks because like back row is pretty much irrelevant. We just kind of play through it, and it really comes down to going second. It's just really not as good as it used to be in Yu-Gi-Oh, right? You know, this card got a lot of hate too. It opened up the doors for a lot of decks that normally wouldn't play things that would be, you know, able to synchro and go for these really insane combo plays. Obviously, yeah, not so good anymore, Capo, because, you know, a lot of stuff gets hit by the Banhammer. But nonetheless, speaking of cards getting hit by the Banhammer, Norden also on the list. I remember back in the day when I used to play with, Mermails, this card was just so incredibly powerful. Just being able to target another level 4 or lower, and you bring back Dragoons, you go for Dragoons, and you get Dragoons effect like 2-3 times. So one of the old Yu-Gi-Oh cards, really in general, just the not once per turn. This card got a decent amount of hate too. Just kind of giving you guys some other cards here. I don't know if this would make it the top 10, but you know, you can tell me what your thoughts are. A lot of cards that open up the doors for FTKs, like for example, Tempest Magician. It only really sees plays when you're just basically doing FTKs, basically punch up spell counters, remove all of them, and you one-shot your opponent. And it's like the same thing with like a Magical Explosion. That was kind of a card that got some hate as well. But a lot of these cards are kind of the same thing. It's just like FTK sort of cards. Number 16, Shockmaster. This card is probably never coming back. Being able to know what your opponent is playing, usually you would just call monster effects, and then your opponent could not monster effect. It was a GG. This was another card where it was like lockdown, you can't play. It almost is like the same thing as like Oppression, Skill Drain. It's like you're basically locking your opponent out. and it's you declare one card type. That type can't be activated until the end of your opponent's next turn. So yeah, very, 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 very powerful. And then you just be like, okay, my turn. This card is like kind of the same thing. I think this card will probably deserve a spot on the top 10, not only because like it was a problem in the TCG for a little bit, but then it like came back up in Master Duel, and it was just a huge thing in the community as well. Like, you get enough cards, your opponent can't normal, you can't, like, your opponent cannot really play Yu-Gi-Oh! And a lot of these cards, again, they're kind of in the same boat here. I would say this card probably deserves some hate. This card as well is the same thing, though, at the end of the day. I might group up some of the cards because not playing in the form of making like Exceed is like the same thing. I mean, granted, you still have to have all the attachments, so it's a little bit more difficult for like 86 compared to Calamities for certain decks, so there's just like 2 level 9s, right? Soul Charge, oh, I remember this card. This card was one of the most, like, reading the effect on this was just mind-blowing. Just like, you special summon any numbers, it's a monster reborn for as many as you want. I mean, yeah, you lose 1,000 life points, but does that really matter? Yeah, you can't conduct your battle phase, but like, you can make so many negates to the point where it doesn't really matter. And the fact that it was just a spell card and it didn't need any like prerequisites, other than obviously you have to pay the life points. So this does not matter in the most scenarios of Yu-Gi-Oh! This card actually was very interesting because this card actually saw some competitive play. People would basically go into time where they would heal, win one round, and then they would draw, and then be like, well, I won the other game, I win. This card actually is so funny that this card is actually on the list for a lot of people's hate list. It's because both players' life points become 0. It like draws it out. So basically, you would basically troll your opponent. It's almost like in the same boat of Final Countdown, but this thing was even more annoying because they would stall much harder, and then they would flip this card and be like, ha, now I win the entire match. I think this card, it might have to be grouped up with like Final Countdown and stuff because, again, it's kind of the same idea in terms of like what you're doing. Now this was in what Joey's World, and I don't think it's ever been reprinted. But like, this set was terrible, and the reason why so many people hated this card is it was incredibly short printed. If you guys remember, trying to get your hands on a 6th Sense was just ridiculous, and that is because, again, like it was the only thing that was selling that set. And I think this card will probably make it on the top 10 when I do drop that video, is because it was literally a dice roll. You would dice roll to go for a game. I mean, being able to go for, what is it? You declare 2 numbers from 1 to 6. Your opponent rolls a 6-sided die, and if the result is one of those numbers declared, you draw that many cards. Otherwise, you send a number of cards from the top of your deck to the graveyard to equal the result. Like, this card would still see some play in this day and age, right? If it was illegal. But the thing is that, yeah, any card that lets you potentially draw 6, yes, it's a dice roll, I get it, but still being able to draw like even 4 cards is just ridiculous. It doesn't really matter. It's going to be what, 5 and 6, right? Because I believe you declare the 2 numbers, then your opponent rolls the dice. But yeah, that is just drawing 5 to 6 cards is crazy. Or just even milling, because like even if you look at Needlebug Nest, that mills what, 5? Pretty insane stuff as well. Next up, Trap Dust Shoe actually was a card that got a lot of hate, and the reason why is like we have, what is it? Isn't Appointed Red Lotus on the list? Being able to see any of your opponent's cards is such a huge advantage in Yu-Gi-Oh! And when you can get it turn 1, I know there was some mentality. Some people, what they would do is they would actually keep Trap Dust Shoe, and they would wait for their opponent to like go for a heavy storm, like wanting to go for the big play, and then you flip it up. Again, knowledge is power in Yu-Gi-Oh! And being able to see what your opponent has is just so good. A lot of cards that let you see your opponent's hand have all pretty much been banned this day and age. I think Level Eater got a little bit of hate because it was like an infinite card. Basically, there was a lot of loops with this card. I'm not sure if I would consider on the list, but I've seen anything that can go infinitely is pretty annoying to deal with. But there's a lot of other cards on the ban list here. Let me know down below if you felt like I missed on any really key important cards for competitive or even in casual Yu-Gi-Oh! Because I want this to be across the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! Versus just in the current meta, because obviously the current meta, TR Elements will probably be the most hated at the moment, but throughout the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! There are so many Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards that at their time, they dominated that current format. But let me know down below, and like I said, in the future, we'll be making another video going over the top 10. If you are new here and you do want to see that, hit subscribe, turn that bell, and I'll see you guys in the next video, which, yeah, later down this week, we'll probably drop that top 10 list. But thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.